Taiwan's exports have sharply taken off in the past few years, and its surplus with the rest of the world, most notably in the US, is larger than ever. So why has its currency, often seen as among the most undervalued in the world, remained so stable? Does the NT dollar still fit in its economy? And what would a stronger currency mean for people and businesses? For some of those answers, we are joined by Paul Cavey. He's the founder of the East Asia Econ platform, which analyzes market data from China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Now, Paul, if you had a choice right now to earn your income in Taiwan dollars or US dollars, what would you choose?
Oh, that's a very good question, which means I don't know the answer.
Savvy.
And I think maybe that's the way of, the difficulty for people in Taiwan, right? Like the kind of difficulty you face right now is, on the one hand, if you sort of believe all the economists, right? Like most economists, maybe not in the central bank, but most economists outside would say that the currency has been very undervalued for years and really should be a lot stronger. Now, if that's what's going to happen, you really need to be earning Taiwan dollars, right? And for the first time for 30 years, earning Taiwan dollars should become an attractive proposition. Obviously, if it doesn't happen and we're still in this where we've been for the course of the last 30 years, actually that's probably going to be a very bad choice, because ultimately the currency will end up depreciating once again. Now, I tend to think that this is a sort of generational change that's going on. And again, because of the things we've talked about, and one of the things you just mentioned, if you look at the trade surplus between Taiwan and the US in particular, it's exploded over the course of the last 3 to 4 years. And I think this is one of the things that's sort of underappreciated in Taiwan, just how sort of crazy some of the economic data has been since COVID. So I think the trade surplus with the US has gone from something like $1 billion a month to $10 billion a month just over the course of the last 2 to 3 years. And why is this? This is because TSMC exporting to NVIDIA and so on. So it's really like a very strong macroeconomic story. And I think given that context, I would think that this Taiwan dollar appreciation that we've seen probably still has further to run. And that's something that therefore should impact both the way people think about the Taiwan dollar, but then also in terms of how rich Taiwanese people are. Because obviously and I think this is, when you think about every election that happens in Taiwan, right? One of the big complaints that people have is wage growth is too low. Like, one of the ways of thinking about wage growth is, do you think about it in Taiwan dollar terms only, or do you think about it in US dollar terms? And a lot of people tend to think about their incomes in US dollar terms because they will compare how much they earn with their friends and their relatives working overseas. And it's in this respect, I think, that Taiwan dollar appreciation can be very important for households and very important for individuals in Taiwan, in a way which I think is often underappreciated by a lot of the population that lives here.
You used the word generational, and it's something I've been seeing quite a lot in the course of my research. What do you mean by generational?
Because, again, if we look at what the currency has done over the course of the last 30 years, it just hasn't moved, right? Like, at least relative to how you think about, like, big developed economies, which I think we should be thinking of Taiwan in that context. The currencies do move over time, both because of cycles and because of structural changes. What are we seeing in Taiwan today? Well, a very sort of exceedingly strong cycle, actually, if you think about the trade data, and a lot of structural change built up over the course of the last 30 years. So that ending out of the hollowing out to Taiwan, to China, the fact that the manufacturing sector is doing so well, like the banking sector problems of the early 2000s have been resolved, and so on. There's a bunch of things we can talk about that mean there's been a lot of structural change. And yet, despite all of that structural change and the strength of the cycle, the currency has remained between 28 and 33 for 30 years. And so that is the generational change. Is that range now going to break? I think that's the critical thing for markets, and the why the Taiwan dollar is now in the news so much, because that's, I think, at the back of everybody's minds.
When you refer to the hollowing out to China, you're talking about manufacturing, a lot of the manufacturing moving to China. As far as the generational change goes, I believe in 1992, the US dollar got to around 25 Taiwan dollars, but the economy has grown so much since. Why haven't we seen the dollar or the Taiwan dollar move in tandem with that?
So again, I think that's an important context to think about today, both because if you go back, again, one of the things I think people don't realize about Taiwan is that people know about the problems that Japan had from the 1990s, and those problems were because of the starting point for thinking about that is the Plaza Agreement of 1985 and the big appreciation of the yen, which resulted in interest rates coming down in Japan and equity market going through the roof. Taiwan's bubble was bigger than Japan's at that point. So it wasn't a party to the Plaza Agreement because obviously Taiwan isn't treated as a country, but it was suffering from the same pressures because in 1985 the trade surplus with the US was enormous. As a result, when the yen appreciated, the Taiwan dollar also appreciated, interest rates came down and the equity market went through the roof. So why is that relevant today? Because one of the things that happened as that process played out was the economy then was in a poor state in the early 1990s because the currency had appreciated so much, and that pushed a lot of exporters into hard times and pushed manufacturing out into China. So why does the central bank and policymakers in general, why are they sensitive about the currency? Because we've been, again, this situation where the currency doesn't move for a long time, there are going to be a lot of exporters who won't be able to cope if the currency does continue to appreciate. Now, arguably, from a macroeconomic perspective, that isn't something particularly to worry about, because if the currency appreciates, the economy changes, households become richer, they spend more money, the services sector develops, and so on. But obviously, from a policy-making point of view and from a political point of view, if companies start to go bust because the currency is appreciating, that's not going to be popular with politicians. So there are sort of issues that the Taiwan economy will have to overcome if the currency is going to continue to appreciate. But it's that parallel with the 1990s and the pressure that came from the US, the big appreciation of the currency, the monetary policy changes that happened domestically, that parallel seems very relevant today.
Bring it back to the trajectory of what we're seeing now here. According to the IMF, the implied PPP conversion rate of the Taiwan dollar is about 13.4 NTD per US dollar. So that would be their rate. What does that mean? And does that also mean that Taiwan people are poorer than they should be because of the weaker Taiwan dollar that we see compared to what the IMF is saying?
So one way you can think about that is if this is sort of an economic, sort of a bit of a technical point, but worth trying to explain. So you can measure GDP in different ways, like when you're trying to compare with different countries. So you can measure GDP in US dollar terms, or you can measure in PPP terms. And PPP terms is essentially trying to account for the cost of living in different economies. So if you take those two different comparisons, if you look at Taiwan GDP on a PPP basis, on a per capita basis, Taiwan living standards are about 90% of US levels. Like Taiwan's a very rich economy, it's very developed. If you live in Taiwan and you stay in Taiwan, you should feel like you're having a very prosperous, good life. On the other hand, if you look at it in US dollar terms, Taiwan's GDP is only about 50% of US dollar levels. And the reason, and the difference between those two things is the point you just raised about the exchange rate, that is the exchange rate undervaluation that Taiwan has. It's the difference between those two things. Now, why is that important for households? Because if the Taiwan dollar appreciates, you would think that the difference between US dollar GDP and PPP GDP starts to close, and essentially then households should start to feel better off than they have done in the past, particularly again in US dollar terms. And so I think that is the sort of the critical thing that the IMF is trying to get to, that the cost of living here is very low, but because the currency isn't worth as much as it could be, when people try to travel overseas, and especially when, I sort of see this, right? When you see friends here that are comparing their salaries in Taiwan dollars with the US dollar incomes they could earn overseas, there's a huge disparity. And some of that, again, just reflects where the currency currently is.
Okay, so what will a significant appreciation of the Taiwanese currency mean for then household wealth and the distribution of wealth here?
So one thing it should mean is that people will start to feel like, so you can, again, we can see it in data released over the course of the last few days, in fact. So yesterday, Taiwan released inflation data for June, and that shows that, for July, and that shows that import price inflation has come down a lot. So import prices are now falling. Why is that? Well, it's simply because the currency is appreciated. And so if you're buying imported goods from overseas, like if you're buying like a washing machine from Japan, for example, the cost of those things should start to come down. So for households, that should start to matter. Mm-hmm. The distribution of wealth issue will be important for sort of two things. So one is, what's the central bank and policymakers' reaction to this? Because again, this is going to cause problems if the currency continues to appreciate. It's going to cause problems for SMEs where their margins are very low and they've been exporting to the rest of the world. Like, is that going to be a fiscal policy response, or is it going to be a monetary policy response whereby the policymakers try to insulate or offset the impact of that. And obviously, if interest rates come down, in terms of distribution of wealth, what's going to be the impact of that on housing prices, which have obviously been one of the CBC's big concerns over the course of the last year or so. So that's one set of issues to be thinking about. The second thing is in terms of that company distribution. So again, if you think about like a company like TSMC, I mean, they say that when the currency appreciates, their profit margin will come under pressure. That wasn't seen in the results this time around. And I think it's probably fair to assume that a big company like TSMC that's so dominant in the world actually will end up with quite a lot of pricing power. But again, the smaller companies aren't going to be doing so well. And so you have that income distribution and asset distribution problem that comes through that differentiated strength of different sorts of companies in Taiwan. So those sort of issues will become important. But having said that, it's also important to remember that the fact that the currency hasn't moved for so long also creates distribution issues in the economy right now. They're just maybe not so visible to people because we've all been used to this, right? Or Taiwanese people have been used to this for 30 years. So it's not the sort of thing that is debated or is particularly obvious because people just assume that that's the way it is, right? The currency is around 30 because that's the way it's always been, rather than thinking that that's really a policy choice that the authorities here are making and holding the currency there.
Well, Taiwan has enormous, as you've been talking about, enormous holdings abroad and in US dollars. We've spoken about life insurers, companies, and even private citizens. So what does that mean for the economy and for us as normal citizens when that fluctuation happens? Do we see a lot of that money coming back to Taiwan?
So again, there's different sort of perspectives or different things to be thinking about within that. So one is, and again, if we come back to the issue about the central bank and the sort of concern like to manage the rate of appreciation, why is that? Because then you just think about if you're a household, if you've got like $1,000 in US dollar savings, but you live in Taiwan and your spending is in Taiwan, if the currency suddenly appreciates a lot, that $1,000 isn't worth so much. And if you think about that from Taiwan from a macro perspective, as we talked about earlier, where there's net foreign assets of more than 200% of GDP, there's a lot of wealth that's stored in overseas assets. That wealth will fall in value if the currency appreciates suddenly. And again, that's both a distribution issue, but it's also a macro issue for Taiwan, because actually it could make Taiwan feel poorer rather than Taiwan feeling richer. So there's kind of a process that needs to play out where that process is going to be managed. So I think that's sort of one aspect of that question to be thinking about. And now I've forgotten what the question is.
You answered it exactly. What is the knock-on effect? So, given that Taiwan has huge holdings abroad, is there a knock-on effect if we see the Taiwan dollar suddenly appreciate, particularly against the US dollar? Is there a knock-on effect in the US for the people and companies and businesses of the US?
Well, so I think, again, suddenly is probably the operative word. So ideally, the currency would appreciate more slowly, but continue to appreciate, in which case people have more time to adjust their portfolio holdings, and so they don't face that asset loss because of the currency moves very suddenly, and it's something that the authorities would be more comfortable with. But again, like the point about the US impact on that, I mean, Taiwan, and I think it's sort of underappreciated. Like Taiwan is a very big global investor because of this position where foreign assets are 200% of GDP, and Taiwan's a very developed, rich economy. So I don't know the exact figures, but there's certainly research showing that Taiwan is a very significant overseas investor in particular sorts of bonds in the US. And therefore, if companies were forced to sell those bonds to bring their money back into Taiwan because the Taiwan dollar was appreciating quite quickly, that is something that does have an impact on the bond market in the US. So that is important for the US. It's also important for Taiwan. Now, whether policymakers in the US, some of them understand this clearly, whether the people making the decisions understand all of the ramifications of what's happened, this build-up of Taiwan's position that's happened over the course of a generation, unwinding that in a short period of time, whether that's really appreciated in all the people making decisions seems a bit doubtful at the moment. But I think,
to put it politely.
Yeah, to put it politely. But I think from a Taiwan perspective, certainly, the ideal situation from a macro point of view, I would argue, is that the currency does continue to appreciate. It does break through that 28 to 33 barrier. Doing so helps the household sector in Taiwan. but that process plays out less quickly than it has done over the course of the last 8 weeks or so, because the more quickly it happens, the more damaging it can end up being for Taiwan.
All right. A large part of Taiwan's export is made up of chips and AI-related technology. Would it be fair for the strength in these exports to push up the whole currency, affecting all other industries? Is that a scenario that could happen?
Yeah, so one thing people talk about, like economists talk about, this idea of the so-called Dutch disease. And the idea being is that you have an economy that's very dependent on one particular thing. Because that one particular thing, particularly it's a commodity generally, so that commodity does very well, the price goes up. That means that the exchange rate appreciates because you have a current account surplus generated by that one commodity. But that's terrible for the manufacturing sector because the manufacturing sector isn't the thing that's resulting in the currency appreciate. Now, in a sense, Taiwan has the opposite problem because it's had this very dominant company, TSMC, doing fantastically well, and yet the currency hasn't moved at all. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, you're having a sort of effective, exchange rate is too low in sort of some ways for TSMC, but as a result, it keeps a lot of other companies in business. And so that's the problem from here, that if the currency, I think from a macro point of view, again, TSMC isn't some, successful but small company. It's a successful, massive company within Taiwan's economy. And just, some statistics on that. Semiconductor exports are now about 50% of total exports, right? And we've seen it this year with exports exploding upwards, but all because of semiconductors. So it's not like TSMC is not a macro story, or semiconductors are not a macro story for Taiwan. They are, which I think means that it justifies the currency being stronger. But the strengthening of the currency will result in problems for other sorts of companies which don't export the sort of things that TSMC in the semiconductor sector is. So from a sort of policy perspective, it's like, what's the better thing for the economy? I would, probably 20 years ago, TSMC wasn't so big. Now it is a very large economy. It's a very large sector within Taiwan's economy. And therefore, it justifies having a bigger impact on things like the exchange rate and things like interest rates than it would have done previously. And I think that's sort of the change that's happened since 2020 with this takeoff of the export sector. It means that we shouldn't be thinking of Taiwan's economy in the way that it was driven by SMEs. Mm-hmm. It's much more driven by the semiconductor sector. Right. And therefore, policy should move around that.
One sector and one major company within that sector. At this point, I just want to point out to our audience, we have done a show on the Dutch disease, particularly effect, and how Taiwan plays into that, or how it plays out in Taiwan. Please do check it out on our YouTube channel. But we are just about wrapping up here, and before I go, I have to ask you the question, so where do you see the Taiwan dollar heading? Short term and long term. I'd
say, to be realistic, and you can see this over the course of the last 4 weeks, let's say, like if the US dollar starts to strengthen, one of the reasons why the Taiwan dollar strengthened, it's an exchange rate. So it's both what's happening in Taiwan and what's happening with the US dollar. And what's happened over the course of the last month or so is the US dollar suddenly appreciated again, and therefore the Taiwan dollar got a bit weaker. My sense is still, I think that the Taiwan dollar is probably more likely to continue to appreciate because of both these structural and cyclical drivers that we've been talking about. The economy is large. It's been developing very quickly over the course of the last 4 years or so. Taiwan has all of these foreign assets that are overseas, and probably Fed interest rates are more likely to come down than go up, which means that you will continue to see currencies other than the US dollar appreciate, and Taiwan should be in that bucket. So that would be my expectation.
All right, we'll call you on it. Thank you so much, Paul Cavey. Great to have you on the show, breaking down these gyrations of the new Taiwan dollar and so many complex factors that all feed into it.